In the medieval world, food was not a matter of comfort or choice. It was a question of survival. Every meal, every grain of bread, every handful of grain or wild plant determined whether a person would continue into the next day. There were no supermarkets, no preserved abundance, no guarantee that tomorrow would bring anything at all. For most people living in the so-called Dark Ages, food existed in a constant state of uncertainty. Daily life in medieval Europe was shaped by agriculture, but agriculture itself was fragile. The majority of people were peasants who worked the land under harsh conditions. Their survival depended on harvests that were completely exposed to the forces of nature. A good season meant stability for a short time. A bad season meant hunger, weakness, and sometimes death. In this world, food was simple, extremely simple. Bread formed the foundation of almost every meal. But this was not the soft, refined bread of modern times. Medieval bread was often coarse, dark, and dense. It was made from whatever grain was available, wheat in better regions, but more often barley, rye, or oats. In poor years, people even mixed in peas, beans, or ground acorns to stretch the flour further. Bread was not just food, it was survival, compressed into a hardened form. Alongside bread, the second most common food was porridge. Grain boiled in water, sometimes with a little milk if a family owned livestock. Porridge filled the stomach, but it offered little variety or nutrition. It was eaten morning and night, repeated endlessly throughout the year. For many peasants, this repetitive diet was the only thing standing between them and starvation. Vegetables existed, but they were seasonal and unpredictable. Onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots, turnips, and beans were common when the harvest allowed it. These vegetables were often grown in small garden plots near homes. They were not abundant luxuries, but carefully protected resources. When winter came, most fresh vegetables disappeared, leaving dried or stored foods as the only option. Meat was rare. For most peasants, meat was not part of daily life. It appeared only during special occasions, after successful hunting, or during festivals. Even then, the meat available was often tough, salted, or preserved in ways that would extend its limited shelf life. Wealthier nobles and landowners lived differently, of course, enjoying roasted meats and elaborate feasts, but for the majority, meat was a memory more than a meal. Dairy products like cheese and milk were more accessible, especially in regions where cattle or goats were kept. Cheese became one of the most important ways to preserve nutrition over time. It could last longer than fresh milk and provided calories during harsh months. Still, even dairy depended heavily on livestock survival, which itself was threatened by disease, weather, and feed shortages. One of the most important survival strategies in medieval food culture was stretching everything as far as possible. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were reused, bones were boiled to extract nutrients, and stale bread was softened in water or broth. Soup became a critical part of survival because it allowed even the smallest amount of food to feed many people. A pot of boiling water with grains, herbs, and scraps could sustain a family through difficult days. Hunger was not occasional, it was constant. Not always sharp, but always present. People lived with a background awareness that food could run out at any time. This shaped behavior, decisions, and even social structure. Meals were small, rationed carefully, and stretched across days. Children learned early that food was not to be wasted under any circumstances. The land itself provided additional survival resources, but even these were unreliable. Wild plants, berries, nuts, and edible herbs were gathered when available. However, foraging carried risks. Not everything in the wild was safe to eat, and knowledge was required to distinguish between nourishment and poison. This knowledge was passed down through generations, often without written records, relying on experience and observation. Agriculture was the backbone of medieval food survival, but it was exhausting and uncertain. Fields were ploughed using animals or human strength. Seeds were planted by hand. Harvesting required intense labour in a short window of time. Everything depended on timing and weather. A delayed harvest or unexpected storm could destroy months of work. There was no backup system, no stored global supply, no emergency aid. If crops failed, entire villages suffered. If winters were harsh, stored food ran out faster than expected. If droughts came, fields turned to dust. The difference between survival and starvation could be a single season. Winter was the most dangerous period. Food stores shrank as months passed. Fresh produce disappeared. Animals were slaughtered or died due to lack of feed. People relied heavily on preserved foods: salted meat, dried grains, stored roots, and hardened bread. Even then, supplies were limited. Winter was not just a season, it was a test of endurance. Inside homes, food was shared carefully. Families gathered around fires not just for warmth, but for survival planning. Portions were divided with precision. Everyone received just enough to continue functioning. Overeating was impossible. The goal was not satisfaction, but continuation. Disease made food survival even more difficult. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making illness more deadly. At the same time, poor storage conditions meant food could spoil or become contaminated. There was no scientific understanding of bacteria or infection. People did not know why food caused sickness, only that sometimes it did. Despite these hardships, medieval societies developed systems of cooperation. Villages worked together during planting and harvest seasons. Shared labor ensured that no single family carried the entire burden alone. Tools and knowledge were shared within communities. Survival was collective rather than individual. Social structure also influenced food access. Nobles and landowners controlled large portions of agricultural production. In exchange for protection, peasants worked the land and provided crops. This feudal system created clear divisions in food quality and availability. While elites enjoyed abundance during feasts, peasants lived on the edge of scarcity. Yet, even in this world of constant struggle, food carried meaning beyond survival. Meals were tied to festivals, religious events, and seasonal gatherings. During certain times of year, communities came together to share what little they had. These moments were rare, but important. They reminded people that life was not only hardship. Religion also played a role in food survival. In many communities, food scarcity was understood through spiritual interpretation. Prayers were made for good harvests, protection from famine, and relief from suffering. Churches and religious institutions often provided guidance and sometimes limited aid. Faith did not increase food supply, but it helped people endure uncertainty. Children grew up fully immersed in this reality. There was no separation between childhood and labor. From a young age, they contributed to survival, fetching water, collecting firewood, helping in fields, or caring for animals. Food scarcity shaped their understanding of the world early. Life expectancy was low, and this influenced how food was valued. Every meal mattered because every year mattered. There was no assumption of long life or stable future. Food was not taken for granted because survival itself was not guaranteed. Looking across medieval Europe, it becomes clear that food was not just nourishment, it was the center of human existence. Every system, agriculture, economy, social structure, religion, and family life, was shaped around the question of how to obtain enough food to survive another season. In the end, medieval food survival was not about abundance, it was about endurance. People did not live with comfort or security. They lived with uncertainty, repetition, and resilience. They survived on almost nothing, yet they continued. And that continuation itself is the quiet truth of the medieval world. Survival was not exceptional. It was daily life.